It's a pleasure to be here in Brussels, our own capital, the capital of Europe. And for those who've been walking around in the city, you have noticed that there's a lot of history going on. And that's what I'm going to talk to you about the history of Dystonia. So what you see here is a scene from Little Dorrit, which is a novel by Charles Dickens, who was a 19th century novelist, an English novelist. And he was very keen and very well in, very good in observing people. And in many of his novels appear people with all kinds of movement disorders like tics and also dystonia. There was one example of a laryngeal dystonia in one of his novels. But as you can see here, there's this person who shows a deviation of the head. And Charles Dickens describes him as a person who carried his head to one side as it were a little bit too heavy for him. So this is a sign that dystonia is certainly not a recent phenomenon. And it also shows that you can go back in history and find traces, examples of people displaying all kinds of different forms of dystonia. And you can go back very far. So already in the ancient history, like this Egyptian picture, you see someone with a deformation of the foot, which resembles at least some kind of foot dystonia. It is not entirely sure if this is a true dystonia. This might also be an example of poliomyelitis, which was very prevalent in that era. But already there are people seen, so we find traces of people with deformations resembling dystonia. When we move on and we come to the ancient Greece, we find the origins of our Western medicine. Well, we find a number of descriptions of deformations, especially of the neck. Some of them might refer to tetanus or meningitis, but some of them might even refer to true cervical dystonia. And the most compelling example is the example of Plutarch, who described or who wrote about Alexander the Great, who lived a couple of centuries before him. And Alexander the Great is depicted manifold with the head slightly turned to the left. And this is also written down by Plutarch, but this is, as I said, a couple of centuries after he lived, so we're not quite sure what his exact sources were. It is now suspected that Alexander suffered from ocular cervical dystonia. But nevertheless, this is maybe one of the oldest examples for which there is evidence of a true form of dystonia. Not only in Western societies, but also in Latin America, you find traces of dystonia, and especially this figure has been seen or as an example of blepharospasm in Latin America, more specifically in Peru, in the Mochica sculptures. And Mochica people were very proficient in displaying traits of patients in their sculptures. So then come the Middle Ages. So we move on through time, and the Middle Ages are characterized by the display of many people with handicaps. And when you look at this picture, it is from the cathedral in Osma, which is north of Madrid in Spain. There's a famous tableau. You can see it over here. And there is a number of people displaying specific features. And this is one of these figures. As you can see that he has his head deviated to the right. And he has he's lost his fingers and even parts of his hands. It is thought that this displays ergotism, which is a kind of intoxication with a toxin from a yeast that occurred in herbs. So this is one of the things that were seen in that time. But this is considered a form of secondary dystonia. The Middle Ages were also the time when monks were meticulously writing in their books. This was a very tough job. And you find writings about the great pain of the right hand of the writer. And as you can see in these consecutive images of writing from a monk over decades, you can see that there's a deterioration of his writing, which resembles what we know to be writing dystonia, eventually with some kind of tremor. There's some unsteadiness in this writing over here. So this is considered a sign of writing dystonia in a monk in the Middle Ages. In the Renaissance, we have an improvement of pictures. So the pictures become better and the pictures become very realistic. This is one very famous example. It's the yawning man. And people were always thinking that Peter Bruegel, who painted this famous picture, was in fact depicting someone at the height of his yawn. But the late David Marsden, I'll come back to him, referred to this as a form of orofacial dystonia, and he launched the term of Bruegel's syndrome, which is not very common. We prefer the term, or we more frequently use the term of Mage Syndrome, and Mage, we will meet him in a couple of minutes. So this is one picture that was retaken in modern history of dystonia, about a potential case of orofacial dystonia. Around this time, we find a number of terminologies that occur for the first time in the writings of writers. So the first time that torticollis, cervical dystonia is the term we prefer now, that torticollis was suggested was in a novel by Rabelais, who wrote a famous book about giants. And at some time, one of these giants had his head cut off, and they wanted to put the head back on, but they have to make a cask to prevent the head from bending. And this is what he was even writing down, afin qu'il ne fût torticollis. This was not a sign of torticollis. They were not fearing for cervical dystonia, but this is a kind of mockery referring to the bending of the head by the Catholics. So this has a totally different meaning. But this term was introduced into the literature, and we find it about 100 years later in this poem by Scarron, who was a burlesque poet. And you can see that at that time, he already uses the term torticollis. So in fact, this was the first time that we find a terminology for a dystonic phenomenon in literature. Unfortunately, the other phenomena of dystonia that we know nowadays occurred much later and were going largely unnoticed until much later. In the 18th century, there were attempts to find some cause and to find some classification for dystonia, because people really didn't know what it was and where to put it and how to look at it. And there were some famous nosologists, and the most famous one was Linnaeus, who made a classification for plants and animals. But in fact, he also tried to do or to make a classification for diseases, but he didn't know what to do with dystonia. And he put it under the heading of motor disorders. There were spasms, they were seen as spasms or contractures. But there was really no specific nomenclature for what we now see as dystonia. So the big turn really came in the second half of the 19th century, and it was triggered by a number of events happening at the same time. There was first of all the advent of photography and cinematography. So for the first time, people could now demonstrate cases of dystonia to others. People could show their material and their patient to other colleagues. We had two famous figures that dominated the thinking about medical events largely, and these were Charcot, who worked in Paris, in La Salpêtrière, and Charcot developed what he called his méthode anatomoclinique, which meant that he wanted to correlate lesions in the nervous system with symptomatology. which is very difficult in the case of dystonia. And his case was, if you can't find something wrong within the brain, then it's a functional disorder, and we call it a nevrose. In English, we call it a neurosis. At the same time, we had Sigmund Freud, who developed the psychoanalytical thinking, and his ideas converged to the fact that early events early in life could lead to physical dysfunction later in life. And this was the origin of the concept of hysteria and neurosis. So this dominated the medical thinking around that time, and his pupils, the pupils of these people, were very influenced by this way of thinking. First, you had Edouard Bristow, who was a pupil of Charcot, who used photography for the first time to show patients with cervical dystonia. And as you can see, these are classical pictures of patients with cervical dystonia who also have an alleviating maneuver, a geste antagoniste, who was not really recognized at that time as a feature of dystonia. So he was followed by his pupil Henri Mage and to a lesser extent Feindl, who went on with research in this area, and Henri Mage became interested in the orofacial dystonia, which later became Mage Syndrome. And these people thought, in fact, that this was a mental and functional disorder, especially the fact that this geste antagoniste, which was coined by Mage, that this geste antagoniste was incompatible with an organic problem. So in fact, at that time, these people considered dystonia largely as a non-organic disorder. And in fact, when you looked at the brains of these people, nothing could be found. So this confirmed, in fact, or this coincided with what Charcot had tried to contribute. This word came widely known, and it was spread, this knowledge was spread, especially in the Anglo-Saxon literature by Wilson, who translated the work of Mage and Feindl and Bristow in his famous book on neurology in the first half of the 20th century. But at the same time, other things were happening. People were seeing patients with more generalized deformations, with generalized cramping, as it was called. The first, in fact, that noticed this phenomenon was Dystonic, and his contribution was largely unnoticed and has been forgotten. He was followed by Babinski and Pierre-Marie and others who described this phenomenon and were more or less convinced that there must be something organic behind this. This cannot be truly functional. So there is already some kind of discussion and debate going on in the movement disorder community from that time, from what causes this phenomenon. And then comes 1911, when Oppenheim, who worked in Berlin, described for the first time what he called dystonia. And he described it on the basis of cases like this: Jewish people where a disorder ran in families and who had generalized deformations that were characterized by alterations in tone. And this is why he called it dystonia. And although he could not find lesions in the brains of these people, he considered this an organic disorder. In the 20th century, the discussion and this debate continued. And especially the German school and some people from Eastern Europe continued to oppose to the fact that it could be an organic disorder. So they considered this some kind of psychological dysfunction, and it was called by many people as a torsion neurosis. So this illustrates the fact that they saw this rather as a non-organic disorder. Gradually, people shifted back to the fact that this was indeed something that must be organic. And the first of them to go back to the organic view was Mage himself, who realized that he might have been wrong in stating that this was a mental torticollis and mental dysfunction. He saw similarities in his patients with focal dystonia, in people with generalized dystonia, and in people with encephalitis, he noticed dystonic features. And these were clearly cases where something organic was wrong. It was also noticed that this disorder runs in families in a number of cases, and therefore this is hard to reconcile with a functional disorder. This discussion went on until the 70s, when David Marsden is one of the pioneers and the founding fathers of modern movement disorders. David Marsden clearly stated that this is something that we had ignored for a very long time. This was in fact an organic disorder, under the umbrella of which a number of dysfunctions that went unnoticed or unrecognized for ages are now displayed. And this is dystonia as we have come to know it up to our ages. This was confirmed also with some neurophysiological observations, and this is truly the foundation of dystonia as a new concept, and the concept that we know now. And the issue was finally set when Laurie Ozelius in the 90s discovered the genetic disorder we call now DYT1. So now we are in the age of a modern view on dystonia. We have a delineation of a concept of dystonia. We have a modern definition which was reviewed a couple of years ago. And this definition tells us that dystonia is in fact a very broad concept. It harbors a number of characteristics and abnormal movements, such as tremor. There is a relation with ongoing movements, which is characterized by overflow movements and geste antagoniste, as we know it now. Is the issue totally set right now? Well, not really. There are issues to be resolved. In fact, the interplay with psychological function in patients with dystonia is very clear. And there's an excess of psychopathology among dystonia sufferers. We still have a lot of trouble with functional dystonia, which really exists. And this is truly a problem in cases where dystonia starts after an event, a physical or a psychological trauma. So dystonia also confronts us with some of our most profound issues, which are the issues on dualism of mind and brain. And this is something that we have to think about, and an issue that has to be settled in the future. But perhaps the most important reconciliation that we still have to make is the fact that we have to make people aware of dystonia. Awareness for dystonia is truly needed, even after ages of recognition of patients with weird alterations of posture, weird deformations, whatever. We still have to work on that, and this is why I'm very glad to be here, and this is why I want to congratulate Dystonia Europe and all the dystonia federations for the wonderful work they've been doing. Thank you very much.